Hello, everybody. Thank you for your patience as we get the screen share up and working. First off, I want to say I hope everybody's having a good Wednesday, and welcome to today's Improving Talk. Before I get started, just want to call out that Zoom's question and answer feature, as well as chat features, are enabled. Feel free to make use of them, and we'll try to get questions to Bethany as we go. Bethany will also be offering prompts as we go, so your responses in chat would be greatly appreciated. With that said, I want to hand you over to Bethany Hilton, our Director of Corporate Affairs at Improving, who will be sharing with us her talk, Understanding Ourselves. Bethany, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see my video in the screen. And Danny, I'll be able to prompt you to move the slides, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Awesome. So thank you all so much for being here. This is a topic that I am extremely passionate about. And I got an opportunity to develop this talk over back in 2020 during COVID. And this is my first time really getting to share it with you all. So just really, really happy to be here and to talk about this. Now, Danny, you can go to the next slide. So now for this, we're actually breaking it up into 3 short sessions. This will be the first one. We want to make sure we're looking holistically at all of the different areas that relates to understanding ourselves. So we're going to be focusing today on increasing self-awareness. In our second class, more around increasing empathy, which is our connections, not just to ourselves, but to others. And then our third class will be more around connecting to our own inner voice. Growing up in various societies and cultures, we're given a lot of messaging and a lot of information about who and how we're supposed to be. And so this particular class that third class will help to kind of identify and support you finding your own inner voice and understanding what messages are from yourself and what are from society. So for this, first, if you can go back, Danny, to the self-awareness. So first of all, as far as a definition, it's always really valuable to start with that. So getting an understanding of what self-awareness is, I pulled up a definition just to help with that. So self-awareness is a conscious knowledge of one's own character, feelings, motives, and desires. Now, the interesting thing about self-awareness is that it's very hard to monitor our own self-awareness. We're not going to necessarily know how much we know about ourselves, but we can always be trying to work on and continue to grow in our awareness of ourselves. The more you understand these parts of you, the more you understand how you function, how you think, all of that, the more you're able to mold and change the way that you think. So a lot of times the things that we're unaware of are the things that we have no control over to influence or change. And also self-awareness helps to lead to greater awareness of others. The human experience is very varied, but also it's deeply similar. And so the more you experience yourself and understand yourself, the more you're able to offer empathy and compassion for others and their experiences. So, and as we go, if you have questions and you put them in the chat, let me know. We'll be looking at that too. So next slide, Danny. Okay, so we are a combination of so many different parts. There's different needs, different functions, and different roles that all of these parts play. And so one of the ways to help us as we're going through this is to separate some of those and talk about them. So people, cultures, societies can tend to rely on one set of functionalities versus all of the rest. So we want to break them down. The first being the mind, which is the second slide that's here. So with the mind, and if you want to put in the chat, what do you think the mind generally relates to? So for example, it might be perception, reasoning, discernment, decision-making, science, logic, rationale. What are the things that make up the functions and the roles that our mind plays in being a part of us? So feel free to put those in the chat. Yeah, so fears, hopes, joys. Yeah, so our mind is extremely powerful And it is very much around our ability to experience our lives and reason. So as we move to the next one, the body generally relates to not just, our body is integrally connected to our mind as well, but our body has a lot of other functions, and it's very much focused on maintaining the health of all of our systems. So if you might guess, for example, I would say in the US society, a lot of people focus primarily on the mind. So there's a lot of emphasis on and a lot of emphasis on understanding our thought processes, on being logical, rational, reasonable, sensible. That is a lot of the focus. Now, there may be other people or societies that will focus a bit more on our physical needs, on taking care of our bodies, on our health, all of that. And then there's a third group also, which when we relate to the heart, we're not necessarily talking about, the functions of the heart, like pumping blood, maintaining our blood pressure, all of that, but more about our intuitions, our sense of inner knowing, our emotional experiences, our dreams, and our desires. So as we're going through this course, these three areas, you can go to the next slide, Danny. These three areas are really important for us to reflect on how much attention are we paying to these, because obviously the goal would be to find some balance between all three. And so if you have a second, you can draw a circle for each area. If you think about where you tend to focus. So do you tend to focus a lot on rationale, reason, science, logic? Do you tend to focus on emotional experiences, or do you tend to focus on what your body is feeling in those particular moments? So you can draw the circles to relate to the size. For me, you can see the sizes are different. For me, I have a tendency to focus more effort on the mind, rational reasoning, logic. And a lot of this probably relates to growing up in the society that I did, where in the US, we very much value using our heads to figure things out versus maybe our hearts or our intuition. So as you write those down, if you have any, please feel free to drop in the chat if you have any epiphanies, any realizations as you're going of, okay, I have a tendency to rely on one more than the other. So these three areas, we're working to find more of a balance with them. Next slide. And so for today, because our society tends to focus so much on our mental processes, I wanted us to dig deeper into what that looks like and how we can have a bit more influence over what our mind is doing. And so that's where we'll focus for this class. All right, so the subconscious. Roughly 90% of icebergs are underwater. And the scientists propose that many of our mental influences are similarly below the surface. So for our subconscious, it plays a lot of roles there. It protects us mentally, emotionally, and physically. It allows us to process billions of bits of information that are coming at us all the time. And it really does an incredible job in so many ways. However, as we've continued to evolve as humans, there's many of these things that have become subconscious that potentially aren't serving us anymore, that we would want to make a little bit more conscious so we can evolve our own thought process and experience. So we want to take a look below the surface. Next slide. Our subconscious is like the ocean. So from the surface, everything seems calm, but there's a million things happening underneath. So you can see with these pictures, the more we can increase our understanding of what's happening underneath, the better. But most of us have very, very limited views into what our subconscious is doing all the time. So some of the things that are happening under the surface would be things like processing information, storing beliefs and values, determining our memories, monitoring all of the information around us, and deciding what to send to the conscious mind and what to store for later. So, for example, there's things that we think that we know, and over time, we'll get more and more information from our subconscious that helps us to shift what we saw before. So just as on the ocean, we're not that aware of what's happening underneath. there's a lot of things that are taking place that really drive how we think, feel, and act. And as this is happening throughout our lifetimes, sometimes we're not even aware that anything is happening at all. And so because of that, we tend to have little ability to influence what our subconscious is doing. And next slide. Okay, so with subconscious programming, while this programming is happening all of the time, we are getting messages all the time that are directing our subconscious to do the things that they do. But there is a time period, which is generally the most intense period for our subconscious programming. And this is the time that a lot of your beliefs and perceptions become solidified. So if you want to take a guess in the chat, what those subconscious programming timeframes are that are super valuable. Anyone? Yes, close, very close. So typically, yes, early ages, someone said 2 to 5. So that time frame before the time that you're 7 to 8 years old is when most of your beliefs and subconscious programming is fairly solidified. As you get older and into your teen years, you're still experiencing a lot of things that might shape how you are. But as we get into our adult life, a lot of those are already very much solidified. So because of that, it takes a lot of energy and effort to be able to go back into what these programmings are, understand them, and if we want to shift and change them. So they've really unconsciously shaped and formed us. And if you think about it, how much of you consciously sat down and said, I want to believe this about the world, or I want to have these thoughts, I want to have these feelings. It's typically just handed to us over that time period. And then that's something we're left to decide what we want to do with. And it can be really difficult to unlearn some of these preset beliefs that are not serving you, but it's not impossible. So this is where the awareness comes in, that the more we can explore this, the more we can choose what to discard and how to reprogram. Yes, in the chat, you were saying, yes, you're programmed by your parents, your family, early activities, exactly. So there's the subconscious programming that's happening, and then there's the conscious programming. Conscious programming would be things that we're doing all the time, learning a new skill, learning how to drive, learning how to cook. All of these things are ways that we actually intentionally deliver information to our brain and try to store it. And so it's good to know that we have that ability to intentionally decide that we want to learn something new for our brains. But we also have to know that at the same time, there's a lot of things that we're not controlling that are just being delivered to the subconscious. So next slides. So as we talked about, childhood is the early stage that you're going to receive a lot of this subconscious programming. And as a child, we're a fairly blank slate, like a greenfield project. So we don't have any really mental blocks. So if somebody tells us that Santa Claus is real, all of those things, we have no information to oppose that. So we immediately accept anything and everything. And you'll see this is why a lot of children end up reflecting a lot of their parents' behaviors and beliefs, because those things aren't questioned later on. Next slide. So with programming, there is inherited programming and there's experiential programming. So inherited programming would be things like genetics, how you look, how you behave, maybe what your body is capable of or not capable of. So there's genetic coding that is inherited for us. There's also human wiring. So each one of us gets some level of program that's exactly the same. Our, sense of fear or all of those kinds of things can be very much delivered to all humans. So we get biologically programmed, even before those ages. But then once we get into that age group, we tend to experience a lot of experiential programming. So with the inherited transfer is what I call it. With the inherited transfer, there's a lot of great things that can come from that. And, any of your parents' strength, whether they're athletic or musically talented. A lot of those things can be transferred onto you. You didn't really have to work for it. It's just there. However, negatives can also be passed along to you, things like inherited dysfunctions or physical challenges, mental, emotional, all of those can be passed along too. So we receive the good with the bad, and then it becomes our responsibility to try and help shift that. There's even some research that's showing that even things like our experiences from our parents, if they experience some sort of a significant trauma or something like that, that we can even show up having markers of having reactions or ways of dealing and coping with those kinds of experiences, whether or not we've had them. So that's still newer research coming out. Next slide. Okay, so with this one, this is an exercise that would take quite a while. So I'm putting in the chat a link for all of you. And this is an exercise called a genogram. So in creating a genogram, if you're all familiar with family trees, this is where you go back through and you identify all of your parents and your grandparents and maybe their genetic patterns. If you've ever done genetic testing or something like that, you'll look at all of their genetic patterns and maybe what you may have inherited and move from there. But a genogram is a bit more in depth in that it's going to help you detail out things about your family history, not just looking at physical, but also relational dynamics, personality, significant experiences or major events, cultural details. There's so many things that might have defined who they are. And that story is actually unconsciously shaping you also. So as you look into something like this, it helps bring more awareness to what might be your family patterns or dynamics and how it may have influenced how your brain is formed and subsequently how you show up in the world. So if you all have questions about that later, but take a look, the link should kind of guide you through how to do this. And it's extremely powerful for you to be able to trace not just genetically what you may be predisposed to, but also many, many other things. And the reason we're spending all this time working on that is because if you can identify patterns, then you have the power to change them. If not, and we've all seen it, we know the phrase, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, all of that. So if you know what you might have a tendency towards in your family, whether positive or negative, you can accelerate that, you can foster it if it's a positive, or you can choose to work extra hard to change that. Whereas someone that may not have those genetic markings, as we might say, might not have to work on it at all. So the more we can identify the patterns, the more we can change ourselves to suit who we would like to be. Next slide. Okay, so some reflection questions. As we're looking at this, what are some of the things that my upbringing has taught me consciously? This could be, and it's not always a skill, it could be something like your parents said, always be kind or work hard, right? It was very directly given to you, and it was meant to be put in your conscious brain. What were some of the things that your upbringing taught you consciously? And what were some that your upbringing taught you unconsciously? This could be a fear of flying, or it could be a love for amusement parks. But what are some of the things that your upbringing taught you consciously and unconsciously? And then what would you, and you guys can take more time on these questions later, but if you have a few thoughts right now, you can share them in the chat. But what would you like to keep and what would you like to unlearn? So I'll just give you all a moment to think about that. And since we started a little late, I'll continue. But these are some really good questions to reflect on. Yeah, the drive for perfection. Nice. And some of these things are taught to us from society. Some are taught to us by our parents. As little children, we're observing the world around us and we're taking in everything. So we may not always know where they come from, but it's good that we can identify them. Okay, so then that's inherited programming. Inherited is fairly out of our control, but then we also have experiential programming. This is where there's the life experiences that may have shaped you, and they're important not just because they affect us in that immediate moment. Let's say you go through something very meaningful in your life, whether negatively impacting you or positively, And those experiences don't just affect us for that time period, they affect us for the long term. So often when you're having those big moments or big time periods, if you can recognize how they are shaping you and choose to help drive the narrative, then you're going to have more self-authoring. You're creating more of your experiential learning than you are just receiving it. Because there's a lot of messages that we're going to get from the world and a lot of experiences that if we can drive the narrative on that instead of allowing society or other people to determine the narrative, that will be helpful. So next slide. Filtering your experiences as you are having them is very important. So as you're experiencing something that seems meaningful, feels like it's going to be in your long-term memory, being aware that you already have some inherited programming for how you're wired, which is affecting the current situation, of course. There's the patterns that you may need to work on or change, but then also noticing what you're experiencing in that moment that's shaping you, and really working to understand what of this programming that I'm receiving right now is serving me that I can accept, and what of it do I choose not to accept. So this is why you can see many people have gone through similar experiences that they've come out with different stories about those experiences. They've come out with different beliefs, and they've come out either stronger or less strong. So we want to be conscious that all of the time our brains are being shaped and shifted. So in all of this programming, what does this programming lead into? All of this inherited programming, all this experience programming ends up solidifying into something we like to call core beliefs. So a lot of these are going to be very solidified when you're young, but as you grow, you can collect some. And if you increase your self-awareness, you have the ability to decide that you want new ones. So experience programming informs our core beliefs. When we experience something and feel a certain way afterwards, that's going to be downloaded and attached to some of these core beliefs. So if you think about it, what is the belief you have about the world? Can you name it? And can you tell me how it affects your thoughts, your feelings, and your day-to-day behavior? For example, if you have a core belief that working hard and sacrificing is the only path to success, how would that affect how you feel, how you move through the world, what choices you make, and ultimately what your life looks like? But if you look at that same example and you say, working hard and sacrificing is the only path to success, or is it? Or could something else be true? So if you think back to your life, it's just a good question to ask yourself, when was the last time that I changed a belief I had about the world? And did I even know that I could? Next slide. If what we believe about ourselves and our world is mutable, then transformational change is more likely within reach. As we get a little bit deeper into our core beliefs, this is a very classic example. There's also the elephant example that says, you see the elephant from one side and you describe it versus the other. So the same with the 6 and the 9. If you are looking at it from one perspective, you're going to experience it entirely differently. So when we're looking at our core beliefs, it's important for us to really hold them loosely and start to explore how we got there. Since all we have is a perception and a mindset through which we see the world, can we actually know what reality is? Every one of us has a filter on us that we may think we're seeing reality, but we're seeing what we perceive to be reality. So all of our realities are going to be colored by our perceptions, which are typically shaped for us through our subconscious programming from a very, very long time ago. So because of that, potentially reality is unknowable. I just want you to go with me. I know that can be argued, but I want you to go with me on a little journey related to this. So what is reality? If you look at that first slide, you see that reality is unknowable. Then we go into what experiences have been a part of your life. So how we determine our reality is also based on experience. So if you look at experience, you've had millions of interactions on, throughout your lifetime. For example, let's say you visit New York City. That's an experience you have. And somebody else also visits New York City. They have the exact same experience. Next slide. However, in our experiences, we can't possibly pay attention to everything that happened. So then you have to ask yourself, what are the experiences what is it within that experience that I paid attention to? So these same two people went to New York City. One visited New York City and noticed, he paid attention to the abundance of culture, the variety of foods, the endless activities, the international access, all of that. And the second person went to New York City and noticed the trash on the streets, the wind tunnels, the packed subway trains, the cramped living spaces. So two people went to the same place, had the same experience, but they noticed something entirely different. So then next, it's not just about what you pay attention to. We don't even stop there. We also add a theory to what we paid attention to. So we have an experience, we pay attention to something within that experience, and then we create a theory around that. So if we look at all of these things, we noticed that the cultural experiences, the variety of foods, the international airports, when we noticed those things, we could create a theory that living in New York City would increase my quality of life. But if we paid attention to the subway, the trash on the streets, all of that, we could decide that it would decrease our quality of life. So now we have a theory about something we paid attention to within our experience. Next slide. After that, it's again, and you see how far we're going from reality at the moment. So after our theories, then we make judgments about it. So we decide whether this conclusion is good or bad. So if somebody says something to you, you don't just hear the words, you also hear the meaning you make for it. And you also decide if that meaning is positive or negative. So once we have our theory, then we create a judgment and we say, well, this is good or this is bad. Then from that judgment, we're on the next slide. So with that, then based off of that judgment, we then determine what our beliefs will be. Now, all of this is usually very subconscious. I doubt that any of us go through our day walking through this for every thought that we have. So now we get to a belief. Now, when somebody asks us, oh, what would you think about living in New York City? We say, I believe that New York City would be a great place to live, or I believe that it would not be a great place to live. So we have, obviously, I tried to use something that's very standard and easy to associate with, because there's a lot of examples of what is not as simple or obvious to be able to see that two people might have two different experiences. So once you get to your beliefs, then you get to what everybody loves to call the obvious. This is where you're like, it's obviously a great place to live. It's obviously not. And this is where people in many, many, many categories, religion, politics, culture, everything, when they get to this space, they start to think that the other person is obviously not very smart, because to them, what's obvious is not obvious to the other person. So with the New York City example, it's very easy to give the room or space for others to have different experiences and preferences. But I want to ask you to challenge yourself. What are the areas of your life that we forget or are reluctant to allow people to have their own preferences? So what is an area that is obvious to you, but that may not be so obvious to others? Yep, logic. Yep. Yeah, there's many of these. Someone said New York City is really awesome. Yeah, that's a good one with the profession. And this is where we can have conversations, and we've all done it, where we're like, how is that? That person is so crazy. How are they thinking like that? How is that what they think? But they may think the exact same thing about us. But if we start going all the way back down this ladder and we go back through our beliefs and our judgments, we'll see where we started to differ from them, we'll see where the space changed. And then we'll be able to see that it wasn't so obvious. Sometimes we assume that others know what we know and therefore don't share it. That's true. Yeah. And the ability to look at things from both sides. Yes. And sometimes it's not just, it's good. Sometimes it's not just both sides. It's all of the reasons why we got to both sides, because it very much depends on all of these things we've been talking about. So as we continue and we're accepting or changing our core beliefs, the more we do this for ourselves, because of course it's a curious, interesting thing to walk through somebody else's thought process. But if we can look through our own thought process, then we can start to challenge what we believe to be true about the world. And I used to use this example when I was in sales, where I would say, if I believe that me sending a follow-up email to a very busy executive is bothering them, then my actions are going to be, I'm going to be reluctant to send it. I'm not going to send it as often, and I'm less likely to get the business and get the opportunity. So I said, or what if I tell myself that this executive is very busy and what I have to offer is important, and he would be appreciative of a follow-up. So if I can choose to believe that story, because we're always making up stories, if I choose to believe that story, then I'm much more likely to do the actions, which are the follow-ups and the reaching out, to be able to get to the conclusion I want. So the more we see what we call limiting beliefs, the more we can help ourselves to shift them. And we can do it very consciously and intentionally. We can sit down and say, okay, I have this belief that's not serving me. Now what? What can I do to change that? And how we do this, I don't know if you're all familiar with a topic called neuroplasticity, but this is the idea that our brain, well, it's not easy. It's similar to working out or building a muscle, but it can form and reorganize synaptic connections. So if we always have the same response to something, we can actually work to change that and shift that. And our brain, they can see it in science. They can see that shifts and changes over time. So the more that we expose ourselves to learning or experiences, then we can rewire our brains. So taking those core beliefs out, examining them, and seeing how they're serving you or not is helpful. And all of us have ones that are serving us very well, and all of us have some that are not serving us at all. Next slide. Yes. So you have just an incredible opportunity with neuroplasticity, that even though we were given so much information that we didn't have a choice whether we accepted that belief or not, we can now go back and review it. So a great way to do that is when you have an experience where you don't like how you showed up, you can reflect on what might have been driving that behavior. And then when you have an experience where you're very proud of yourself, or you feel that it was a very successful experience, you can go back and ask, what were the beliefs that were driving that behavior? So we don't just focus on the negative, we focus on encouraging more of the positive beliefs, and we work to shift more of the negative beliefs. And here's a challenge that I have for you all. So this is actually very difficult to do, but think through and choose a core belief that's deeply important to you. It could be around family, it could be around politics, anything. But what is the core belief for you about the world? And then your supporting rationale for it. So that will be easy to come up with. Typically, like, I believe that children need to have a great education, and then I can have all my supporting rationale for that. But then what is the opposite of that core belief, and how could that be true? And this is where you'll maybe physically experience mental blocks, where it'll be like, no, there's no possible rationale for it. No, there's no possibility that this could be true. And so as you are working to explore those, you have to really push yourself in this one. But when you do, it doesn't mean that you're deciding that's true. It doesn't mean you're accepting it. It means you're challenging your brain to think differently. And it might glitch a little bit, but you can do it. And then secondly, what is a core belief about yourself and your supporting rationale? And then what is the opposite of that core belief, and how could that be true? So with this one, I would encourage you to choose something that maybe is a limiting belief, like, I'm not very good at XYZ, or something that seems to hold you back in life. And then you can ask, what if the opposite of that were true? If you have the idea that, it's not easy for me to make friends. What if the opposite were true, that it is easy for you to make friends? And how could that be true? What's the supporting rationale? So you challenge your brain to try and explore the complete opposite. And then this, of course, leads to empathy when you're experiencing other people who their obvious is not your obvious. You're able to say, okay, wow, how could that be true? How could that be true for them? And how can I take those steps to try and see that side and that point of view? Next slide. Okay, cool. So in review, and I wanted to leave some time for questions. I know this can be a challenging topic with a lot of words. So, but just as a reminder, we have a lot of subconscious programming that happens to us very early on in childhood, that while it's going to drive a significant amount of our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and actions, we still get to choose. If we can reflect and build awareness around them, we still get to choose what we keep and what we don't keep. And we can do this through conscious reprogramming. And we do it all the time with learning new languages, with building new skill sets, but we can do this with building new ways of thinking and feeling and being also. We talked about inherited and experiential programming, how it's important to reflect on your upbringing, because your parents' and your grandparents' story can very, very easily become your story if you don't choose to explore a different line of thinking or reasoning. And then experiential programming, where as we're going through life and we're having these experiences, what is it that you are telling yourself about those experiences? Can you tell yourself a story that will serve you better, so that when you come out of those experiences, you come out with a stronger, more positive outlook? And then reflecting on our core beliefs, working to challenge those core beliefs. Core beliefs can be extremely sensitive and important. So you don't have to, it's not an exercise in changing those core beliefs. It's an exercise in understanding them. And then if you see core beliefs that aren't serving you, that you want to change, then you work to change those. And you change those through neuroplasticity, giving yourself time and effort to believe something else about the world, telling yourself something different, surrounding yourself with people that believe something different. All of those things will help to rewire the synapses in your brain. So in reflection, we want to be a bit balanced in that we want to talk about what is it that you, in reflection, what is it that you thought about what we learned? What did you feel? And then how did you connect to it? So anything you want to put in the chat, and I'll take a look at it over here. And if anybody has any questions, if they want to unmute and ask their questions, I'm happy to respond. Yes, I have some resources. So let me add those to the chat. There's an incredible book called Liminal Thinking that I highly recommend. And then I have some others as well. So let me see if I can find those. Might have to send those later. I will get that to you, Anthony. Other questions, other thoughts, other feelings? So in the following topics, just to give you all a little pre-screen. So for the next topics, we'll be discussing empathy. And this is really the next, taking these ideas to the next stage, and understanding that every person you interact with had probably a different subconscious programming experience, probably had different conscious learnings, probably had everything different. And so because of that, when we are approaching people, we can have empathy for the fact that they may think entirely different than us. They may experience things entirely differently than us. And so we can leave the space and room to connect. And the more that we are able to shift how we think, the more we're able to provide tools and resources for the people around us to think a bit differently as well. And then the third class will be around really understanding and processing the society messaging that we get. Because if you go to one part of the world, they tell you that this is the right way to live. And if you go to another part of the world, they tell you this is the right way to live. And they're two polar opposites. So what we know is that human beings have a very polar ideas about what is right, what is wrong, what is okay or not okay. And so as we explore that, each society probably got some things right and probably got some things wrong. So we are so much a product of our environments and our societies. The more that we can explore others' ways of living and thinking and being, the more we can take all of the goodness from all of the places versus just focusing on one particular way of being. So we'll continue the conversation. Thank you for putting up with the technical challenges and all of that. Much appreciated. And thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Bethany. Yeah, as a reminder, these recordings do get posted up at improving.com/virtual events. So you can hop over there and get a nice recap of this great presentation. With that said, we at Improving hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you, Bethany.
Thank you so much. Thanks for hosting.